Onesmos Nesib was born around 1856 near Haramu in today's Ilu Abbaa. His original name was Hika, an Oromoo name meaning translator. His father died when he was 4 years old. Raiding tribesmen stole Hika from his mother and sold him as a slave, giving him a new name, Nesib. Nesib was again stolen from his owners and sold 4 times before Werner Munzinger, 1832-1875, the vice-consul of the French consulate, liberated him at Massawa on the Red Sea coast, where missionaries from the Swedish Evangelical Mission, SEM, had a boys' school headed by Rev. Bengt Peter Lundahl, 1840-1885. Here, Nesib was given to Mr. W. Aalborg, SEM, as a servant in October 1870 and become one of the students of that school. Mr. P. E. Lager, SEM, became his first teacher, but Lundahl took over in December of the same year. A bright student, Nesib was soon converted and, when he was about 16, he was baptized on Easter Sunday, March 31, 1872, taking the Christian name Onesmos. Even as a youth, he led a life of Christian devotion and completed his education in 5 years at Massawa. He volunteered to be a missionary, hoping to evangelize the Oromoo people someday in the future. His prayer was, "How long, O Lord, how long will it be before you send a preacher of the gospel there?" In 1876, Lundahl sent Onesmos to Sweden for further education at the Theological Training Institute of Johanneland, where he stayed another 5 years. He returned to Massawa in the fall of 1881 ready to go out as a preacher of the gospel to his country. A classmate, A. W. Palman, 1852-1931, came with him as a volunteer. As Onesmos had married 19-year-old Meret Halu, she also came along, accompanied by her father and 3 others on the journey to Welaga. This was the first Oromoo expedition, which failed from the outset because Emperor Menelik's raiding armies hindered peaceful travel southward. Consequently, Lundahl planned the second Oromoo expedition, by way of Sudan to reach Welaga, since the short highland route could not be used due to the emperor's decree against Western missions. Onesmos and his group traveled by ship north of Massawa port to Suakin, where they were favorably received by the governor, and then undertook a 12-day trek through the Nubian desert by camel. At Berber, they took the boat across the Nile and reached Khartoum in early December. From there, after obtaining a travel permit, they sailed up the Nile for another 2 weeks and then traveled on camelback. On January 4, 1882, they reached Famaka, the Egyptian border post on the Nile, and rejoiced at the sight of the Ethiopian hills rising above the plain. However, they were told that they could not reach the Oromoo land as easily as they thought and were advised to proceed through Asosa. 3 of them went to Asosa only to discover that it was impossible to reach Welaga from there. Instead, they were told to try going through Metema. In the meantime, they began suffering from fever in Famaka, and the 2 foreigners were not allowed to pass through Metema due to the imperial decree, though they were only a 2-week journey away from Welaga. These obstacles, as well as the tribal unrest in the area, the slave trade that Egyptian authorities enjoyed secretly behind the backs of the Europeans who tried to stop it, and finally the dishonest advisors who kept them in the dark, led them to despair. They left Famaka for Khartoum on March 2, 1882. In fact, little did they know, they were only about 60 kilometers from Asosa, where the Sibu Oromoo lived, a people yet unreached either by the Orthodox priests or by the Muslims. On the way back, 1 man died, Palman lay unconscious on deck, and Onesmos suffered so much that his only desire was that the Lord would take him home. Finally they reached Khartoum on April 10, 1882, when the Mahdist revolt had broken out throughout almost all of Sudan. Onesmos hovered between life and death while the others kept improving day by day. One couple, still weak, was sent back to Imkulu, but Meheret and Irenaeus, the doctor, remained in Khartoum until Onesmos had regained his strength. A few days later, the group in Khartoum was informed that the way from Metema though Gojam was open not only to Ethiopians but also to foreigners. They had prepared to leave for Imkulu, had equipped themselves for the journey, and had bought a ticket when suddenly Irenaeus died on May 30, 1882. After burying him, Meheret and Onesmos left for Imkulu, but had many difficulties because of the Nubian desert, where they were almost buried in a sandstorm. They ran out of water and had several attacks of fever, and Onesmos despaired of ever reaching Imkulu again. But they finally arrived about mid-July 1882, where they rested for several weeks while Onesmos recovered from his illness and exhaustion. He wrote a letter to Stockholm on September 5, 1882, volunteering to resume his journey once more. While waiting for the response, he started writing his first book of hymns entitled 100 Songs and Psalms, and began translating hymns and other small books such as Man's Heart, by Bunyan, and Luther's Catechism into the Oromo language. These first books were published in Imkulu a year later. In January 1883, a merchant from Jimma named Damot came to Imkulu to tell Onesmos the amazing story of Abbaa Jufartu, 1861-1932, a young sultan who was eager to introduce modern education in Jimma by hiring teachers from Massawa. Damot told him how the sultan's messengers had come to Famaka to invite the foreign missionaries to Jimma but had arrived 2 weeks after their departure. Onesmos asked his visitor many questions to see if the people were open to being evangelized and found out that the people were eager to learn about God. So he asked the main office in Stockholm to send messengers of peace through Hera to Jimma and requested permission to go with them. He made this proposal because a German baron had stopped in Imkulu on his way to Hera and needed an interpreter. Hera was a trading center connected to Jimma. This was the third Oromo expedition, in which Onesmos, his wife, and 3 others were given permission to go to Shoa. After waiting until March 1885, they began the journey, encountering severe danger on the way, and finally reached the Shoa border. By order of Menelik II, the group was sent to Aliuamba in Shoa to recover from fever, and they remained there until all had recovered. Since this place was a commercial center, the members of the Imkulu expedition utilized their protracted stay at this town for evangelism and medical care. Onesmos found opportunities to proclaim the gospel both to the local people and to the many traders who came from different parts of Ethiopia. A. Bergman, 1855-1923, gave medical treatment to more than 2,000 people, the majority of whom suffered from syphilis, eye diseases, or wounds. However, all the foreign missionaries including Onesmos and his group were asked to become Orthodox believers or leave. They chose to leave and return to Imkulu, arriving in 1886. On the journey back in early May 1885, Onesmos was happy to see a group of his countrymen who had been rescued from slavery. This really inspired him again to teach and to remain with them for a while. Some of them were also destined to be his supporters in his future career. One lady among them was also destined to be his supporter in his future career. He joined the group of teachers at Imkulu as a member of the staff. At this point, his hymn book was ready for use at the girls' school. Although he was very discouraged because he had had to leave Shoa, this new responsibility challenged and invigorated him so much that he reported, "I labor with delight and happiness together with our newly arrived Gala girls. What a joy it is to teach them in our mother tongue." One of these girls who had a gift for languages and literature was Asta Gano, 1874-1964. As soon as he discovered her talent, he arranged for Amelie Lundahl to award her a Bible on Christmas 1887 so as to encourage her in her gifts. She later made important contributions to Oromo literature assisting Onesmos. In 1886, in addition to teaching, Onesmos decided to work on translating the entire Bible into Oromo. But translating the Bible proved much more difficult than the other texts he had undertaken because he did not have adequate knowledge of his mother tongue in terms of vocabulary and idioms, as he had not lived in the Oromo culture since childhood. Luckily for him, Asta Gano was able to come to his rescue in this area. After finishing school, she was assigned the task of composing a dictionary of pure Oromo words by listing derivatives of every particular root and removing dialectical and alien forms. Even though she was a constant source of material for Onesmos' work as he worked on the New Testament, which was revised and published by the Imkulu Press in 1893, she was not acknowledged for her contribution. This New Testament translation was ready for the Fourth Oromo expedition. A group headed south with it, but Onesmos stayed and continued work on the Old Testament translation, while Asta started translating Dr. Barth's Bible stories and wrote down from memory 500 riddles, fables, proverbs, parables, cradle songs and ballads in the Oromo language. These two authors put together selected versions of the above into an Oromo reader. With Asta's continued assistance, Onesmos completed the Old Testament translation in June of 1897. After revising it, he took the manuscript to the printing press at St. Chriscona, where he personally supervised the printing process. In the midst of this, he was worried about his family because he had left them in Eritrea. In October of 1898 he was shocked to hear that his baby girl had died and that the two older children were sick. He wanted to return home and be with his wife, Lydia Dembo of Scio in Welliga, whom he married after the death of Meheret during childbirth in November 1888. But Lydia, who had a great concern for the gospel, wrote to him saying he should not interrupt the work he was doing. So this allowed him to stay until the publishing work of the entire Bible was complete at St. Priscona in June 1899. This remarkable work of translation has been used for more than 75 years, and a group of experts just recently undertook to revise it. Now when everyone expected Onesmos to go back to Welliga with his new Bible, he was reluctant to do so because he was tired and worn out. He explained in a letter to a friend that the hardships of such a journey would be too heavy on him and his family. So he returned to Eritrea around mid-August of 1899 and began evangelizing the approximately 500 Oromoo people living in Asmara. His work, which focused mainly on the marketplace, bore fruit, although attendance was sometimes as poor as 20 people at a time. On April 13, 1903, Onesmos received a letter from Boji, Welliga, in which the pioneers told him that the evangelism work under the protection of two leaders was promising. At this news, he decided to leave Asmara and return to his country, because the journey was now easier thanks to the railroad built from Djibouti to Dire Dawa in 1902. So the Asmara congregation commissioned Onesmos, his family of 4, Asta, and 4 other people as messengers to the Oromoo on behalf of the church on December 6, 1903. The next day the entire congregation was there to send them off when they started their journey. Although Onesmos expected to meet Swedish missionary and personal friend Carl Cederquist at the port of Djibouti, that proved impossible. Onesmos and the group had to go on to Addis Ababa, because Cederquist was behind schedule by 6 weeks. Onesmos was introduced to Abbaa Mateos, the Archbishop of Ethiopia, by Kentiba Gebru Desta. During their conversation, Onesmos was allowed to freely present the gospel as long as he avoided disputes on delicate questions like fasting and the role of the Virgin Mary and the saints. The Archbishop also helped him to get an appointment to meet with the Emperor, who gave him a safe conduct for the journey to Nakamt, capital of Welliga. All these favors that Onesmos never expected made him very happy, because he believed that all was done in sincerity. The group proceeded west to Welliga on March 28, 1904, as Cederquist was arriving in Addis Ababa only one day after their departure. It seemed that God's will was to be carried out by the natives without foreign staff. Cederquist also chose to live and work in Addis Ababa, where he stayed until his death on November 11, 1919. His work in evangelistic ministry, medical service, and in the founding of an English school laid the foundations for the work of the Swedish Evangelical Mission in Addis Ababa. On April 15, 1904, Onesmos arrived at Nakamt with his companions from Eritrea. He was already known in the area as the translator of the Oromoo Bible and was received with great honor by Dejazmach Geber Egtsiabala, the governor of Welliga. The governor gave him a piece of land and built him a house near his residence, where Onesmos settled down and opened a school, hoping to use this as a means of evangelism. But since he was not a priest, he did not have the orthodox background of his friend Geber Awostateos, a pioneer church leader before him, and did not dare introduce evangelical ideas and practices in the Kidane Meret church at Naho as the latter had done in the Mariam church at Boji. However, these two met from time to time to discuss matters of common concern, while in the open they acted independently of each other. By early September 1904, Onesmos had enrolled 20 students who were divided up into 3 classes. He said that education was so important for the youth that he would accept several hundred students if he only had teachers and classrooms. Practically all the parents were in favor of him teaching their children. He also began proclaiming the gospel to his students, which made the Ethiopian Orthodox Church (EOC) priests uneasy. They had received a letter from the Archbishop saying, "If his teaching deviates from our faith and our church, let him teach and allow no man to prevent him." The Orthodox clergy grumbled over the Archbishop's letter but were not as yet in a position to show the discontent. Onesmos was aware of the grumbling but paid no attention to it. Rejoicing at the opportunities to do evangelism among his own people, Onesmos asked his friends in Eritrea to send him more evangelists and many more copies of the scriptures. In response to his request, 2 families came to Welliga from Eritrea escorted by 3 men who had been sent to Eritrea to fetch them. The journey took them 4 months and finally they settled in Boji and Naho. The Orthodox Church leaders opposed this activity in Welliga, but the governor of the province was friendly to the evangelical Christians who worked secretly in the Boji Myram church where a converted priest had served for some time before perishing in a fire. All the evangelicals who came from Eritrea, including Onesmos, were lay people, and this made the evangelical movement of that time a lay movement. In fact, Onesmos' Swedish mentors wanted to ordain him as a minister in the Protestant church as early as 1883, but he declined for the third time. Consequently, as the Orthodox clergy's opposition to the evangelical movement mounted, Onesmos became a prime target. In the beginning, for the sake of the clergy from Gojam, Onesmos preached in Amharic, the official language of Ethiopia, and had someone interpret into Oromoo so that they would not press charges against him. Unfortunately, his advisor who had instructed him preach this way died and Onesmos started preaching directly in Oromoo. Amharic-speaking clergy did not understand what he said and lodged complaints against him. As a result, Onesmos was ordered to go to Addis Ababa and defend himself. Originally, the archbishop had helped Onesmos by encouraging him to preach Jesus Christ as the only savior of the world. This time, however, in the presence of Onesmos' accusers, the archbishop said that he disturbed the peace of the faithful with his teaching. Later, Onesmos understood the Abbaa's double-dealing tricks. However, when Gemechis, the governor, testified to Menelik a couple of months later, Onesmos was allowed to accompany the governor to the capital, where they together paid their respects to the archbishop. On that occasion, Onesmos was very surprised to be well received by the archbishop, who explained that he could not openly support his ministry without being condemned by the Ethiopian clergy. As a result of this meeting, Onesmos' accusers were called to Addis Ababa to specify their charges, but when they failed to appear, the matter was postponed until after the rains. On June 9, 1906, Onesmos left to return to Naqamte, while it seems the governor stayed in Addis Ababa. But as soon as Onesmos arrived home, he received a letter from the governor, ordering him to come back to defend his case in front of the archbishop since his critics and some witnesses had arrived in Addis Ababa. He was told to get there soon, running day and night. That was a time of heavy rain and the rivers were in flood, making traveling very difficult. Onesmos, about 50 years old at that time, made the journey in 11 days, quite fast considering the circumstances. On July 13, 1906, he was tried on several false charges. Only Alakwa Tegenye witnessed in his favor. Abbaa Mateos, the archbishop, joined the accusers in calling down the judgment of heaven on Onesmos, who was sentenced to lose all his property and was imprisoned laden with heavy chains. The same punishment was to be meted out to all his followers in Welliga, including the governor of Lekka and Welliga. As a result, in order to avoid suffering this punishment and to save face with the local clergy, the governor was forced to carry out the archbishop's orders and to excommunicate Onesmos and denounce his teaching. However, the emperor refused to confirm the archbishop's verdict and ordered Alakwa Istefanos, minister of church affairs, later Afe Nigus, the king's spokesman and minister of justice, to examine the case. Istefanos, who was known for his fair outlook when it came to harsh judgments, listened to the parties for several hours and concluded that Onesmos was not guilty of any crime. The only charge that could be brought against him was that he did not believe in the mediating role of the Virgin Mary and the saints. Menelik therefore decided that Onesmos should stop preaching and teaching. However, the emperor sent him to the Minister of Commerce to see if he had the skills to work there. He was examined for his knowledge of languages, mathematics, and crafts. But since Onesmos did not possess technical skills, he was instead sent back to Naqamte to live on farming and trade. Even though his opponents had crushed Onesmos' hope of evangelizing, they could not get rid of him completely. In September and October of 1907, the evangelistic leaders gathered together for a conference at Naqamte to discuss common policy. After discussing the problems they faced in various places, they resolved to continue their evangelism without hesitation but cautiously, not giving their opponents occasions to accuse them. They acted independently and decided that Onesmos did not have to teach in his school but that he was free to read the Bible to people in his own home and to sell and give away Bibles and other books. In October of 1908, Onesmos was accused of holding devotions and teaching students in his own house. The governor pretended to take the charges seriously and wrote a stern letter in Amharic in order to show the Amhara Orthodox secretaries that he was on their side. In this letter, which he intentionally did not send to Onesmos, he ordered him to immediately stop all teaching, even of his own children. When the secretaries reminded the governor that he had not called back the 3 slave boys that he had asked Onesmos to train, he was angry and told them not to meddle in his private affairs. When Onesmos got the letter at a later date, he understood the governor's support. 4 years later, in 1912, however, the governor joined the archbishop in condemning Onesmos to banishment for life, though nothing came of it because the Council of Ministers did not sanction their sentence. Another year later, in 1913 or 1914, the archbishop twice tried to persuade the governor to send letters and messengers to Cedarquist, urging him to remove Onesmos from Welliga. Cedarquist, however, was not easily intimidated and he flatly refused. Onesmos was allowed to continue living in his home at Nakamt. He still continued to labor for the Lord as before, but, in the autumn of 1915, he reported that the work had slowed down in the last year and a half. His colleagues then came from different districts to help. They held Bible classes together and no one stopped them from doing it. The sale of the scriptures was also growing more than ever in some locations. Onesmos regretted that he had taken only 5 students at a time when he could have dealt with more. In fact, the leader of the Sayo Oromoo people came to Nakamt to recruit teachers from Onesmos who, unfortunately, had none to give him. In August 1916, Cedarquist succeeded in obtaining official permission for the evangelical enterprise in Ethiopia. Now it became possible to establish 2 girls' schools at Nakamt with Lydia and Asta as teachers and another in Addis Ababa with Desta Shimpabdi. 1976 as a teacher. Onesmos rejoiced at the new opportunities for evangelism and planned more centers, one between Addis Ababa and Nakamt, and another between Nakamt and Sayo. Looking forward to more peaceful times, he announced his intention to go ahead and train young men for the task, specifying that he had Fiasa Alabe and Jamo Sori, who were experienced men and dedicated to the Lord. In 1916, Onesmos was granted permission from Lygiasis, which finally established, once and for all, that he was free to proclaim the gospel as he had hoped when he moved from Eritrea to Welliga. This brought the problems of this era to an end. Then the next leader, Ras Teferi Mekonnen, began a program of modernization which was to be characterized by far-reaching religio-political reforms and called for the help of foreign experts. Years later, Emperor Haile Selassie I was fully aware of the benefits of the gospel in the areas of education and medical care for many and, as a result, allowed the gospel to be preached in many parts of the country. The year 1916 therefore constitutes a landmark in Ethiopian Christianity as well as in Ethiopian history in general. On October 6, 1919, Onesmos wrote to Cedarquist that the highest magistrate, Tura Wald Mariam, had stated in public that there would be no peace in town until Onesmos was banished. This man had become a Roman Catholic and that was the cause of his opposition to Onesmos. But 8 months later, in 1920, Onesmos reported to the board in Stockholm that many people owned Bibles and that those who read the scriptures in the vernacular were now aware of the Bible truths and had stopped believing in the legends of the saints. They no longer condoned polygamy, slavery, false witness and lying, and other old practices that many Bible students had condemned. The mission base encouraged him by sending a medical team to Welliga. They established a mission in a small hut and the doctor and Onesmos took turns preaching. Onesmos was thus spiritually refreshed after a long period of loneliness in his ministry. Slowly over time, the animosity between the Orthodox church leaders and the mission leaders wore away after the death of the archbishop. The missionaries and Onesmos continued evangelizing and giving medical care and educating the youth in the area's growing schools. After seeing such peace, Onesmos died at the age of 75 on Sunday, June 21, 1931, the day of the 75th anniversary celebration of the Swedish Evangelical Mission in Stockholm, Sweden. It was a Sunday morning and he was supposed to preach. So he made his way to church very fast without greeting people as he usually did, being in a great hurry because he said he was going to die that day. But as he was feeling some discomfort, he first stopped at the doctor's house near the church. There, before receiving any medical help, he had a stroke and died a sudden death.